Hundreds of thousands of pounds they raised. And most of the doctors that I've spoken to in the hospital in the wake of that project, then they've said the amount of doctors who and staff and patients who use the MRI scanner, and then when they're told that this was actually donated by the local Muslim community, they were flabbergasted, because they never thought Muslims, I mean, you hear the sort of the reform rhetoric of Muslims aren't integrating, and Muslims aren't assimilating, and Muslims are living in their own. But then you have, right in front of you, Muslims donating to the local hospital. So it really helps to change perspectives. And that project was spearheaded by the mosques. So we can see how this is a living, practical example of how the mosque now becomes a force for positive change in the community. Okay, so that's the introduction after the way. So I think what you've done with the mosque here and with the facade, it's fantastic, because it's alluring and it's enticing, and it allows the local Lancastrians to think this is part of the cityscape, this is part of the landscape. And then your job now is to bring them through the doors. Let's carry out a quick exercise. So I want you to close your eyes just for 30 seconds. I want you to actually do this, please. For 30 seconds, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to visualize the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I want you to visualize the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then I want you to ask yourselves what images are evoked in your heart and mind. I'll give you 30 seconds. I'll stop talking so you can concentrate. And then I want some answers. Visualize the Prophet's mosque, and then ask yourself what images are evoked in your heart and mind. Okay, you can open up your eyes now. Let's just have some answers. You don't have to put your hands up, you can just shout them out. Anything. What did you see? When you close your eyes and you try to visualize the Prophet's mosque, what did you see?
Green dome.
Okay, green dome. That's fine, but we're talking about, okay, maybe I should be more specific. The Prophet's mosque at the time of the Prophet. Okay, mud. Anything else? The green dome was a later addition.
Oil lights.
So oil lights and lanterns and lamps. Anything else? Spirituality. Okay, how did that spirituality look? What form did it take in your mind, or just had general connotations of spirituality? Peace, serenity, tranquility. Anything else? I'm sure lots of brothers have things here. I'd hate to have to put somebody on the spot and pick. Pebbles on the floor. So, okay, these are good things. There is no right or wrong answer. It's just to pick your brains and to see how you would conceptualize a mosque. And what do you think the Prophet's mosque looked like? Because we're 1400 years removed from the Prophet's mosque, and we have state-of-the-art constructions like this. And obviously this mosque is meant to be a model emulating the Prophet's mosque. What did the Prophet's mosque look like? And what actually happened inside the Prophet's mosque? So this is just a survey to see what we actually know about the Prophet's mosque. Anything else? Brothers at the back there?
Delegations coming in and out.
Okay, so people moving in and out. Delegation. Delegations of who?
Different tribes.
Different tribes. Okay, maybe I'll get one or two answers more and then I'll move on. Learning and teaching. How did that look like? The learning and teaching. What do you think it looked like?
Focus groups.
Focus groups. Okay, that's good. Study groups. Anything else? I'll have one more person.
The abadi of the masjid.
Okay, very important point from Moulana here. The mosque was inhabited 24/7. There was always somebody there. It was a hive of activity, and it was always bustling. Now, I had some of the right answers here. When you think about the Prophet's mosque, grandeur, architecture, none of that existed. The Prophet's mosque was very unpretentious, and it was very rudimentary, and it was very simple. It was initially a 35-meter squared structure. It wasn't even a building. It didn't have so you had walls made of mud. You had stone foundations that maybe penetrated maybe 1.5 centimeters into the ground. So it wasn't rooted in the surroundings. And there was no roof. There was no carpet. The floor was laid with pebbles. So it was an unpaved enclosure. but it was quite a big space. And at the front of the Prophet's mosque, you had an arcade, meaning rows of pillars. But these pillars weren't made out of marble or any flashy building material. They were made out of simple palm trunks. And then only the first 3 rows had a roof. But the roof wasn't grand like this. The roof was simply straw and leaves thatched together in some sort of a lattice structure. So the mosque was very, very simple. One of the most crude and simplistic structures you could ever come across. But that was the beauty of the Prophet's mosque. It was so unassuming and it was so unsuspecting, because anybody who's off as just a structure of insignificance, then they are gravely mistaken, because that structure shaped the city of Medina, and the city of Medina shaped the entire world. Which is why the third theme I want you to bear in mind today is Madinan Blueprint. That's the name of the talk. So in today's world, we have so many different things facing the Muslim community around the world. And although we've faced tragedies and trials in the past, the perils of today are somewhat exacerbated by the different mentalities and the different worldviews that are constantly assaulting Muslims. So we have a constellation of issues that we have to confront and we have to challenge. So we need some sort of a guidebook. We need some sort of a schema to be able to navigate some of these choppy, perilous waters. So we have the Quran's there, we have the Hadith, but we want something reality. We want something which is more practical. And for that, we want to identify the Prophet's mosque as the locus of change. So if we want society, if we want to be able to relive the glory days of Islam, then the burning $1 million question is, where do we start? And sometimes when I ask myself that question, even I get frightened, and it can be quite daunting, because there are so many places to start. There are so many ways to start. There are so many avenues to enact social change and reform and an Islamic revolution that we sometimes feel overwhelmed and our senses are overloaded. So if we focus on the Prophet's mosque, then that gives us a shared sense of purpose. So we know there's something tangible, there's a physical building. That's number one. And number two is, if you focus on yourself, then change is only limited to yourself. But if you focus on the institution which is meant to run society, the mosque, then change will be contagious and infectious. Which is why scholars, this is a really important concept that I want you to keep in your mind. Scholars have designated the Prophet's mosque, the original Prophet's mosque, as what we call a microcosm of Islamic civilization. A microcosm is a miniature model. So everything there is to know about Islam, Islamic philosophy, an Islamic lifestyle, an Islamic way of living, Islamic ethos, all of that was encapsulated within the Prophet's mosque. So everything's there within this one structure. So it's up to us now to be able to revisit the Prophet's mosque and then pick it apart brick by brick, and then to try and reconstruct it in our modern age. So now we have something a little more tangible, rather than just the abstract theorizations of be a better Muslim, or focus on yourself, or be a better person. Now we have something concrete we can focus on, which is directed towards the mosque. Now, I'm going to be zipping from point to point here, so forgive me if we might lose the thread sometimes. I'll try and reel ourselves back in. Every single person, so that should hopefully set the tone for the speech. The Madinan blueprint is, we want to replicate the Prophet's mosque in the here and now, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is a microcosm of Islamic civilization. The mosque is the nucleus. Everything comes from the nucleus. So if you can set straight the nucleus, then everything else will fall into place. And I'm going to anchor that fact in one hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now you might have heard of this hadith, and you probably would have come across it lots of times, but I've really racked my head against this, and I feel like this profound insight should help us in actualizing this Madinan blueprint and what it actually means. So the hadith is, and it's a very popular one. The Prophet ﷺ said, جُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا. Simple, short, snappy, striking to the point. The earth in its entirety has been made a mosque for me and my followers, and also a means of purification. So the surface level interpretation is really simple. Who can tell me what the surface level interpretation is? What's the Prophet trying to tell us? And it's more so a point of Islamic legality and law. When the Prophet said the entire earth has been made a mosque for you, what does that mean? What do you think that means? You can pray anywhere. As long as it's clean and pure, you can pray anywhere. The second part might be a little bit obscure, but try and use your brains a little bit here. What do you think it means? The entire earth has been made a means of purification. What do you think that part refers to? Tayammum. Right, so dry ablution. So you don't find water, you can use the earth to purify, ritually purify yourself. That's fine. But let's unpack this a little bit deeper, because some really powerful philosophical and social implications here. The Prophet ﷺ, number one, has declared the earth as a mosque. The entire earth. The first thing the Prophet's done here is, he has shattered the illusion that sacredness is confined to four walls. That's number one. So the Prophet is saying here, the mosque doesn't need to have a structure. The mosque doesn't need to have a shell. The mosque doesn't even need to have a building. If I own a piece of land, I can, in the moment, declare this piece of land to be a mosque, and that's it. It doesn't need a dome, it doesn't need a prayer niche, it doesn't need a congregation, it doesn't need a building. It just needs the sincerity of a believer and commitment to the ideal of a mosque. So mosques are more than just buildings. That's a really important point to bear in mind. Mosques are more than just the bricks and mortar of a building. That's number one. Number two is, the Prophet's extending the boundary of the mosque to include the entire world. So the world has been identified with a mosque, and vice versa now. That means every single mosque is now a concentrated version of the earth. The Prophet has identified the earth with the mosque, so the earth is a mosque for you, which means now that every single actual mosque, a legal mosque like we have here, is now a concentrated, intense version of the world and of the earth. So there is now a relationship here. The earth is a mosque, and every mosque is the world and the earth. So what did Allah say about our relationship with the earth in the Quran? Allah told the angels, He declared to them, I'm going to send down a new species and creation into the world. And what will the task of this new creation be? They will be custodians and curators and caretakers of the earth. So that's our job. We've been designated as caretakers of the earth. So to extend that to now the miniature earths and the miniature iterations of the world in every single mosque, just as we have a responsibility to maintain the earth, we also have a responsibility to maintain these miniature versions of earth, i.e. our mosques. Right? Are you following my trail of thought here? Okay. Now, a caretaker maintains. A caretaker keeps something in good nick and in good order, and ensures whatever he's looking after can be operationalized and can be used and should be beneficial to everybody around them. So how do we now, as caretakers of mosques, as an extension of what the Prophet ﷺ said, how do we now maintain these mosques? These mosques aren't to be maintained with bricks and mortar and with building material, but we have to maintain these mosques as you'd maintain a piece of green land, as you'd maintain a piece of the earth, as you'd maintain the world, by infusing spirit and breathing life into the soil. So to revive the earth itself is the job of the caretaker. To revive and keep these mosques maintained and functioning is also the job of all of us here as caretakers. Now this is the punchline. This is the punchline here. So I'll repeat those points again. Because the earth is a mosque and the mosque is our world, we are all curators and stewards, custodians. So when we try to rebuild our mosque spaces, when we try to reimagine our mosque spaces, when we try to reinvigorate our mosque spaces, then we're not only restoring an institution, we're not only augmenting a charity or an organization, what we're actually doing is restoring balance to the world and to the globe and to the earth as a whole. One small mosque, one miniature earth at a time. So those are some of the social, philosophical implications from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So looking after these mosques shouldn't be trivialized and shouldn't be taken as something frivolous, because in actual fact, looking after the mosque is a catalyst for wider global change. And there's actually a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Its authenticity is slightly disputed, but it should be fine to reproduce here. The Prophet said, when the angel deputed by Allah to blow the trumpet and sound the horn for the end of times, when the apocalypse will begin and the earth will then crumble and split asunder, the earth will be liquidated. The earth will be properly destroyed, except for every piece of land that was a mosque. Those lands which had been designated as mosques, right, whether they were confined to four walls or whether they were just open plains, they will survive and they will prevail. Because they are the true pieces of earth. They are the true pieces of land. They are the actual iterations of the world. The world itself, trees, jungle, the different terrains, that will perish. But the actual representations of the world, i.e. these mosques, they will prevail and they will endure even past doomsday and even past judgment day. So these mosques are really, really potent and efficient tools and instruments for change. That's point number one out of the way. Let's revisit the exercise we did at the start. I doubt any of you, and I'm going to list a couple of scenes and vistas that you would probably have observed in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet moved to Medina. And before the Prophet moved to Medina, he was shown in a vision and in a dream the place he was to migrate to. And he told his companions before the migration, we're going to be leaving this forsaken city of Mecca. The Muslims were being tortured and they were being beaten and they were being pushed from pillar to post. The enemies of Islam in Mecca were straining every single nerve to try and make the Prophet's life a living hell. So Allah said, okay, you have permission, you can migrate to Medina. The Prophet said, I'm moving to a place. And the place used to be called Yathrib. That was the old name, but it had negative connotations. The Prophet said, I'm going to rename and redesignate the city as Medina. And then he highlighted a standout feature of the city of Medina. And this is even before he'd migrated, even before he set foot in the city of Medina. He said, the city of Medina has this salient feature, and it has this striking quality, which is it can eradicate evil and vice. The city itself, right? Quite a strange statement to make. The city itself can eradicate vice and evil just like impure material on metals is disintegrated and incinerated if you put it through a blast furnace. So just like impurity on copper is removed if you subject it to intense heat, Medina can remove impurity and vice and wickedness just like this metallurgical process. And when the Prophet ﷺ eventually moved to Medina, now imagine this, he's moved to Medina. All of his companions, the emigrants from Mecca, did they bring anything with them? I'm asking, did they bring anything with them? Did they pack their bags? Did the Prophet say, right, the baggage train will be departing in 5 days, gather all of your belongings, say your farewell, you can set your affairs in order, and then we'll make our merry way to Medina. Did the Prophet say that? All of a sudden, spontaneously, the Prophet said, we have to move, it's no longer safe for us here. So nobody could take anything. Overnight, would have been millionaires in Mecca were now reduced to poverty and privation in Medina. So people like Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and they were the Fortune 500 CEOs of Mecca, when they stepped foot in Medina, then they had nothing to their name. So these people were vagabonds, they were homeless, they had zero social opportunities. So it was really a difficult time. And to make matters worse, the climate in Medina wasn't the same as the climate in Mecca. So the Muslims found it very difficult to acclimatize, and many companions fell ill. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was even, tottering on the brink of death. That's how ill he was when he moved to Mecca, but he thankfully recovered. So there were a host of problems the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to deal with, and a host of social dilemmas the Prophet had to grapple with. But what was the first thing the Prophet did when he set foot in Medina? You tell me. What was that pressing matter which commanded his attention? It was so urgent, he had to delay everything else. He postponed and deferred every other priority, and he prioritized this. What do you think it was? Building the mosque. Building the Prophet's mosque in Medina. That was at the forefront of the Prophet's community building project. The Prophet realized, I'm not just building a mosque here, I'm building a community. And this community will become the microcosm or the miniature model for Islamic civilization as a whole. And the starting point, the epicenter, is this mosque, was the Prophet's mosque. So priorities need to be realigned. We need to reprioritize. The mosque should come at the forefront. The mosque should occupy center stage for everybody, personally and communally. Now the Prophet ﷺ, most people are aware of that fact. But the Prophet, whilst the mosque was being constructed, and according to some estimates, it took around 6 months for the mosque to be built. Whilst the mosque was under construction, the Prophet was also busy plying his trade, and he was busy enacting another program. There was a construction program of the mosque, but he was also doing something else on the side. And this was equally as important as the mosque to his community building project. The Prophet had set in motion the Pact of Brotherhood, or Mu'akhat as it's called, which was a social integration program. So immigrants from Mecca have arrived, and now they need to integrate and also, to an extent, assimilate with the local Madinans. So how do we do that? Draw lots and pair one Meccan with one Madinan. And we've created and forged a new bond of brotherhood. So the Madinan is to share everything. Theoretically, he was to share everything with his Meccan brother. He was to house him, he was to provide him with lodging and food and opportunities and make him feel welcome. Now that project simultaneously took place whilst the mosque was being constructed. And when the mosque had been constructed, now the Prophet ﷺ had a ready-made, purpose-built community center and community development hub. At the same time, he also now had a critical core of users and a critical core of Muslims who could man and staff this new center. The lesson here is, you can't divorce capital from human capital. You can't have a building without people, and you can't have people without a building. Both go hand in hand. The Prophet was at the same time simultaneously building people who could man his mosque, people who could take upon this civilizational mission from the mosque, and also preparing a hub for them to operate out of. So you have this grand spanking new building here. But you also have to realize you need people to staff this place, and you need people to inhabit this place, and you need people to breathe life into this place which would otherwise be a soulless empty shell. So people make up the project. So the mosque construction project is out of the way. Now it's your job to bring about some sort of a mu'akhat program. And from what I've heard, you're doing a fantastic job with the Ansaar association. So there are a whole host of activities and programs that are being launched. So just as people might have contributed to the construction of this mosque, then it's incumbent upon everybody to then also contribute to this Ansaar project, because this is the next phase in community building. So the Prophet's mosque is now built. The Prophet's mosque, and again this is another misconception we have to move away from. The mosque is not an empty, hollow temple. The mosque is not just meant to be a place of worship. Its primary function is a place of worship. But the mosque is so much more than that. The Prophet's mosque was dynamic. The Prophet's mosque was holistic. The Prophet's mosque was integrative. The Prophet's mosque embodied the ideal of Tawheed. The Prophet's mosque embodied the ideal of Tawheed. And this is theme number 4. What do we mean by Tawheed? Can anybody give me an answer? Monotheism, but what does that mean? What does Tawheed mean? We should all know what Tawheed means. Yeah, oneness of God. Worshipping one God. Worshipping Allah, recognizing there is only one God. That's the theological meaning of Tawheed. And sometimes we reduce such a fantastic, potent concept like Tawheed into just one package of the articles of faith. What is Tawheed? Believe in one God. Okay, tick box exercise done. Move on to the next. Tawheed is a grand project. Tawheed is a revolutionary idea. Let me tell you what Tawheed actually means. And this is a more philosophical understanding. Tawheed comes from the root letters Waw, Ha and Dal, which means for something to be one. This specific form, conjugal form of the word, of the letters Waw, Ha and Dal, Tawheed, means unification. So it means things are disparate and elements are scattered and everything's dispersed, and for you to then gather and unify everything and focus everything on one focal point. So when we talk about the theological idea of Tawheed, then we look at the world around us and we look at the marvels of the universe and we observe the natural world and everything Allah has created, and everything, all of our thoughts, our actions, our mindset, our ethos should be unified on Allah. That's what Tawheed means theologically. Socially, Tawheed should mean an Islamizing mission where everything we do in life lead back to Allah. Everything we do should be tethered to Allah. So there is a unification of every facet of your life with Allah. The conventional popular form of Islam where you're only a Muslim inside of the mosque, and when you leave the mosque, like a piece of clothing, you can take it off and you're no longer a Muslim. Clock in, clock out, part-time, nominal Islam. That's antithetical to Tawheed. That's contradictory to Tawheed. True Tawheed means when you're outside in your place of work, then everything you do should be revolving around Allah. Should be centered on Allah. You should be uniting everything you do with Allah. What does Allah want me to do? What does Allah not want me to do? How can I please Allah in my line of work? When you're at home, you should enact the idea of Tawheed. When you are in a social setting, you should enact the ideal of Tawheed. All roads should lead back to Allah. Everything I do should be Islamized, which means Islam should be all pervasive. Islam should be everywhere. I should be seeing the world not through rose-tinted lens, but through Islam-tinted lens. Now, what does that have to do with the mosque? The Prophet's mosque embodied the idea of Tawheed. Every single societal function you could possibly think of, all roads led back to the mosque. Everything a government today, all of the services a government would fulfill, the Prophet's mosque fulfilled that. So I asked you at the start, this is what we mean by Tawheed. All roads lead back to the mosque. Every single function and service in society would be united within the walls of the mosque. So I asked you at the start, try to visualize the Prophet's mosque in its heyday and in its glory days of the Prophet's own life. You'd be surprised. Let's just imagine, we walked into the Prophet's mosque. We were all alive at the Prophet's time. And we walked into the Prophet's mosque. And these are all true stories and accounts, by the way. Imagine you walk into the Prophet's mosque and you see Abyssinian spearmen. So these are a military unit of soldiers by the king of Abyssinia, the Aksumite Empire, as a gesture of goodwill and a token of the king's grace to the Prophet ﷺ. They are in the main prayer hall of the mosque and they're practicing military drills with their spears. And the Prophet ﷺ, his dormitories and his quarters were adjacent to the mosque. So imagine this would have been the Prophet's prayer niche, the Qibla wall, and then the Prophet's quarters would have been just there. There was a doorway and a curtain. Pull the curtain back and you were into the Prophet's private quarters. The Prophet was peering from behind his quarters, observing this fantastic display of military prowess right in the hall of the mosque, with his wife Aisha radiallahu anha observing from behind him. You would have seen that inside of a mosque. Inside of a mosque. In some of our mosques today, that would be scandalous to even attempt to do something like that inside of a mosque. You'd be lynched. I was an imam in Preston for a year and a half, not really an extensive resume, but I saw a lot and I witnessed a lot. And I was an imam in one of the most cosmopolitan mosques, so I got to see everything, all stripes and shades and everything. So it's sad because I came in for Dhuhr once and a newcomer had come in. So our mosque, I won't say the name, but the mosque is situated just near a motorway junction. So there are lots of people passing by, lots of travellers. So we see new faces every single day. So somebody came in, I'd never seen the chap before, and he had a cast on his leg. So he was obviously, he must have injured it somehow. So he went to the back of the prayer hall to grab a chair. And he's injured, so I mean, you can't expect him to be waving the chair and picking it up properly. So he carried the chair to the front, where the fleet of chairs were on the side, and one of the chair legs was dragging on the floor. So it left a little bit of an impression on the mosque carpet. So one of the people from the mosque, one of the management members, I mean, he must have seen it from the CCTV in the office. So he barged into the prayer hall and he flew into this towering fit of rage and he just started grunting at the man, telling him, lift it up, and this is the mosque carpet, and what do you think you're doing here? And, this isn't your own house. And I was flabbergasted. If that man was there, dare I say, if he was there when the Prophet ﷺ was there, overlooking a military drill inside of the mosque, with the Abyssinian spearmen carrying out all of their military exercises, then, I mean, it wouldn't be unbelievable to me if that man would have gone to the Prophet ﷺ and started objecting. So things like that, you would have seen that inside of the Prophet's mosque. Just before the confederation of the Quraysh and antagonistic Arab tribes from Mecca besieged the city of Medina, if we would have walked into the Prophet's mosque then we wouldn't have seen people sat in a lecture like this. We wouldn't have seen people engaged in teaching and learning. We would have seen a military strategizing session. We would have seen a military cabinet, the Prophet's war cabinet, having been convened right in the middle of the mosque, and the Prophet was saying, we have a threat looming on our doorstep. The enemy have arrived at Medina itself. What do we do? So the Prophet went around the room, he canvassed his generals for suggestions, and that was when Salman radiallahu anh gave the fantastic suggestion and proposal of, let's dig a trench and a moat around the city. Whenever the Prophet wanted to dispatch a military contingent, where do you think he did it from? When the Prophet wanted to dispatch his troops to the frontiers, where do you think he did it from? He did it from the mosque. He'd gather the troops inside of the mosque, he'd give them an address, he'd galvanize them, he'd motivate them, he'd give them some parting advice, and they'd be sent off to war from the mosque. Remember, Tawheed. All roads lead back to the mosque. So the Prophet's mosque doubled up as a military headquarters and a military command center. Then, let's say on another occasion, we walked into the Prophet's mosque, and tied to one of these palm tree pillars at the front, there was a prisoner. Somebody who was captured in war, and he was just relaxing with shackles and manacles on his feet and his hands, tethered to a tree. Why would the Prophet have a prisoner inside of the mosque? Because the Prophet's mosque doubled up as a detention center. The Prophet's mosque doubled up as a detention center, as a makeshift jail. And eventually that man would leave the mosque, perform ablution, cleanse himself, come back into the mosque and say, because of what I've witnessed here inside of this mosque, during my days in prison, I am fully rehabilitated. To hear something like that from a prisoner today, usually they just relapse, and the parole officers constantly running after them. Comes back into the mosque after a couple of days, spending his time inside of the mosque. I've done my time, I'm fully rehabilitated, I want to be a Muslim. So you walk into the Prophet's mosque and you would have found a detention center. After prayers, the Prophet ﷺ is the Imam, and he makes his salam from right to left, and he stands up and he has a look at the congregation behind him. He combs every individual and he sees somebody who looks a little bit out of place. He looks disheveled, he looks emaciated, looks like he hasn't eaten in a while. Looks like he's had a bit of a rough time. So the Prophet makes him stand up, and the Prophet said, who's willing to donate money to this person? Somebody else comes into the mosque and lets the Prophet know, I'm a wayfarer and I'm a traveller and I don't have any accommodation. The Prophet, inside of the mosque, just impromptu, spontaneously, what does he say? Is anybody here willing to host this traveller? And immediately somebody's hand shoots up. And this happened regularly. The Prophet would carry out social welfare programs within the mosque. That's what the Prophet's mosque also doubled up as. Then imagine we walk into the Prophet's mosque and you find, right at the back of the mosque, you find a delegation. The brother said delegation, so I'll expand on that. You find a delegation of Christians from the southern territory of Najran who've come into the mosque for what we can say would have been a prototype of an interfaith dialogue with the Prophet ﷺ, to debate with the Prophet. And then the time of prayer comes for the Christians, and the Prophet says, that's fine, you can go to the back of the mosque and you can carry out your ritual worship. You can pray at the back of the mosque, and then we'll continue the discussion. You would have seen that walking into the Prophet's mosque. Then let's take another example. You walk into the Prophet's mosque and there's a raised platform at the back, and there is a whole cohort of students busy learning the Quran, teaching the Quran, memorizing, taking turns, coming and going. I'm going to the market for the day, I'm going to earn money, and then you sit here and learn, absorb and imbibe as much information from the Prophet as you can, and then after that we'll alternate. So you can go and earn a living, and then I'll sit there. That raised platform was known as the Suffah, which is the educational deck. So in modern terms, the Prophet's mosque was also an educational center. Let's take another example. And this is another startling example. You walk into the Prophet's mosque, and at the back of the mosque, right at the back of the mosque, somebody has pitched a tent. And in that tent, there is a black African slave woman. And she had been found in a really poor, wretched state by Aisha radiallahu anha. Her master had mistreated her. So, as temporary accommodation, the Prophet allows her to be housed in the back of the mosque. And this lady then, as a token of gratitude, becomes a caretaker of the mosque. So she's sweeping, she's cleaning, she's brooming, she's dusting. Then one night, the Prophet ﷺ sees the lady in a dream, and she's being presented before Allah, and in her scale, in her pan of good deeds, Allah's adding those small specks of dust she was sweeping up from the mosque, adding it into her pan. And then the Prophet wakes up, and then somebody informs the Prophet the lady passed away. So the caretaker, the janitor of the mosque, passed away. The Prophet asked, what did you do with her? So they said, she passed away at night, we didn't want to disturb you, so we took her to the cemetery and we buried her. And the Prophet was incensed. He was infuriated. He said, you should have disturbed me. You should have woken me up. Participate in her funeral prayers. So the Prophet made an effort to venture all the way out to her grave and then to repeat the funeral prayers. The Prophet never did that. The Prophet ﷺ never, except for this one, did the funeral prayers upon a deceased person whose funeral procession had already taken place. But the point is here, you walk into the Prophet's mosque and you would have seen that lady bivouacked at the back of the mosque. You walk into the Prophet's mosque and you find all sorts of scenes. Those are a few examples and some case studies to really highlight and hit home the fact that the Prophet's mosque was a multifaceted, multi-dimensional community center. It was a communal hub. Everybody felt welcomed in there. Everybody felt like this mosque was mine. And everybody felt like they had a part to play in spreading the civilization of Islam from that nerve center of the mosque. In terms of urban planning, what's really interesting is Medina was a city sporadically inhabited and with sporadic construction plan. So it wasn't as if you had main streets and a thoroughfare and you had one block here and one district there and another sub-district over there. It was quite haphazardous. But with the arrival of the Prophet's mosque, then we see something of a structure and system in urban planning. The Prophet's mosque was at the center of the city, and the urban sprawl that developed afterwards clustered around the Prophet's mosque. So a ring formation of the city of Medina began to form. Because when people moved to the city, then the locus, the nucleus, the center of gravity wasn't the town hall, it wasn't the football stadium, it wasn't the government offices, it was the mosque. So everything revolved around the Prophet's mosque. And finally, the seat of government. Medina was a self-governing city-state. The seat of government, the Prophet didn't have a parliament. The Prophet didn't have a governor's residence. The Prophet didn't have a town hall. The Prophet had his mosque. Everything happened from the Prophet's mosque and within the Prophet's mosque. That is the Islamizing mission. So something like social welfare, a welfare program, right? The companions who were lodged at the back on that raised platform of a sufa, they were part of the underprivileged class of society. They were of no fixed abode. So really that doubled up as a residential facility. So they would also live inside of the mosque. And they'd also carry out their daily needs inside of the mosque. So social welfare programs, civic duty, political responsibilities, everything, you name it, centralized within the walls of the mosque. That's a Madinan blueprint. Now, it's obviously impractical for us to try and replicate this model brick for brick, because we can't exactly turn our mosques into detention facilities. We can't exactly turn our mosques into military headquarters. We can't exactly turn our mosques into some of the things during the Prophet's time. But the point is, that gives us a framework. Anything during any successive period, subsequent period of Muslim history, anything which the people need, services, facilities, and communal provisions, they should be found within the mosque. This is the project of the mosque. And the byproduct is, if somebody comes into the mosque because they're hungry and they're looking for food, then their curiosity leads them towards the prayer hall. And if they're in the prayer hall, they'll see lots of Qurans, they'll see people praying, and they'll automatically be affected. Their heart will be drawn towards the spiritual aura of the mosque. Now, we have had many instances in the past where the Prophet's mosque, the Madinan blueprint, has been replicated. Take, for example, Ottoman history. Has anybody been to Istanbul here? I'm sure people must have, right? You must have visited the Suleymaniya complex. You must have visited the Fatih, Muhammad al-Fatih mosque complex. It was a distinct Ottoman introduction. If you go to an Ottoman mosque, we went to the Balkans last year, with a couple of brothers from Lancaster, and we went to Bosnia. So the Balkans used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. It used to be Ottoman territory. Now what's striking about the Ottoman era mosques is you don't just waltz up upon a building. That's just the mosque. So there's just one structure, that's the mosque. You walk in through the doors of the mosque, you walk out and you're onto the street. The Ottomans pioneered an architectural element called the kulliyah. Kulliyah in the Ottoman vernacular meant a complex. It meant a multifaceted complex, which is why your setup here really warms my heart, because the moment I stumbled across it, it reminded me of an Ottoman kulliyah, of an Ottoman multifaceted, multidimensional mosque complex. Take the Suleymaniya complex. You'd have the mosque slap bang in the middle. And now these mosques are grand and they're imposing, and they're meant to be a soft but powerful projection of Islam. The Ottomans used to call minarets victory towers. So it was a statement, Muslims are here and Muslims are here to stay. And you could see the skyline of Istanbul is absolutely mesmerizing, because you just see domes and these minarets and victory towers for miles on end. And it's a visual representation of the dominance of Islam. So when building a mosque, there is always a bit of a tussle and a tug of war. should we invest in the form of the mosque or in the function of the mosque? Which in architecture they call the form-function dialectic. Which is, should we spend lavishly on the mosque or should we spend lavishly on the facilities of the mosque? Both should be done. Both should be done. They're both equally as important as the other. I would maybe go one step further to say the function should be prioritized, the services and the facilities provided by the mosque, but the form is still equally as important. The form has a supplementary supportive role. Somebody asked Imam Abu Hanifa, should we be spending inordinate and excessive amounts of money on and the cosmetics and the optics of a mosque? So Imam Abu Hanifa very bluntly said no. But he added a caveat. The qualifier was, if by lavishly decorating the mosque architecturally, you intend for the mosque to be a magnet to attract the attention of the non-Muslims, and for the mosque to be an icon and a monument of the city that stands out and people just can't ignore it, it's there in your face, and the non-Muslim across the street will think to himself, hang on a second, I've been living in front of this behemoth of a mosque for so many years, why have I not stepped foot inside of it? Then it's permissible, and it would even be a record to spend lavishly on decorating a mosque, which is fantastically what you've done here. So people won't be able to resist the magnetic pull of the mosque. That's another form of tawheed, right? You Islamize architecture and you Islamize beauty. So that beauty should be channeled towards introducing people to Islam. So anyway, these Ottoman kulliyas, the mosques, were fantastic specimens of architecture. You didn't just have a mosque. The Suleymaniya complex, in its heyday, during the 1600s, you had, adjacent to the mosque, you had a Darul Ifta, which is the office of the local mufti. So mufti would be sat there, 24/7, he'd be available. You don't have to go to the local imam's house every now and again to badger him, and the imams, he has his own personal commitments and his own personal life. There is somebody there, 24/7, who's available to answer your religious queries. The office of the mufti was there. Accessible, open, available. Next to that, you had the madrasa, which was for primary education, the elementary school, where children would go, all within the confines of the mosque. The mosque had a huge, massive forecourt. And you'd find these in all Ottoman major cities. Next to the madrasa, you'd have the college, the higher college of Islamic learning, sort of like a seminary or a Darul Ulum equivalent. Next to that, you would have a soup kitchen. Anybody, Muslim, Jew, Christian, whether you are rich, affluent, poor, a pauper, you could find 3 meals in there a day, completely free of charge. Inside of a mosque. A soup kitchen inside of a mosque. Now, where I live in Preston, it's quite a diverse area religiously, because there's a mosque and then there's a church, and there are 2 temples, there's a Buddhist temple, and then there's a Sikh Gurdwara. So there's a Sikh Gurdwara just down the road. And every Sunday, when I'm coming back from somewhere, I can't remember, on my routine journeys, then I see some Sikhs coming out of the Gurdwara, and they have high-vis jackets on, and they have sometimes they have huge crates and huge boxes filled with food. They have small goodie bags, and they make their way into town, and they give food to the homeless people. They have an open kitchen. So every other day, you'd just see in the car park of the Gurdwara, you'd have a huge table. You'd have these tables arranged in one big line, and people would be invited to eat. Why don't we have that in our mosques? It's something to think about. This is, at the end of the day, a form of da'wah. Da'wah, proselytizing, introducing, exposing people to the beauty of Islam, takes many forms. So da'wah should be the primary objective. But the Prophet ﷺ, he wasn't somebody to turn away a non-Muslim. He wasn't somebody to discriminate. If a Muslim needed his help, he'd be there to assist. If a non-Muslim needed his help, he'd be as readily available. So the mosque should also be a beacon of hope and a place of safety and sanctuary and a haven for not just the Muslims, but also the non-Muslims. Why would we restrict our operations to just our fellow believers when the Prophet ﷺ was sent as a rahmah lil alameen, as a mercy to all of mankind? Aren't the non-Muslims also eligible for our help and our assistance? And again, the byproduct is Tawheed, of Islamizing a welfare project, Islamizing delivering food parcels, because then you're portraying a positive image of Islam. And remember, the study we quoted at the start from the think tank Equi, the 80% view of Islam when they could relate to Islam personally and intimately. So you'd find a soup kitchen, an Ottoman Kulliya. We're not done yet. The list is quite extensive. We'll hopefully wrap up in about 10 to 15 minutes. You'd also find next to the soup kitchen, you'd find a hospice. Inside of a mosque complex, you would find a hospice. So you'd find a dispensary. If you needed medicine, then the chemist would be there to help you. If you needed treatment, then you could find it in the mosque complex. Or if you needed some sort of therapy, you'd find it in the hospice, in the mosque complex. There'd be a cafeteria in the Ottoman mosque complex. You'd also find what's called the caravanserai, which is sort of like, in Gujarati they're called musafir khanas. So a temporary residence. So for passers-by, somebody who's just visiting, and they don't have any accommodation, then you can stay here. You could be lodged inside of this caravanserai within the mosque. And then you'll also have stables as well, within the mosque compound. All of this could be found within the mosque compound. And then the cherry on top, you'd have a huge, massive pavilion. So a socializing space. Now, we have to respect the sanctity of the mosque. This specific place here, this main prayer hall. So we keep our voices down, we don't socialize, we don't fraternize excessively with one another, we don't disturb the peace. But like Umar radiallahu an, he experienced the same problem, where people were turning the mosque prayer hall, into something of a social forum. And there was something of a mingle fest happening inside of the mosque. So what did he do? This is a really important point here, really important, and I can't stress this enough, because I encountered the same problems when I was employed in Preston. You can't critique the dominant culture until you provide a viable counterculture. Let me just say that again. You can't critique the dominant culture until you provide a viable counterculture. Umar radiallahu an, the dominant culture is people were coming into the mosque, and you have to understand the socio-political dynamics. Umar radiallahu an's period as a caliph, the first stage of rapid expansion, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Persia, all coming under the suzerainty of this new Muslim empire, which means new converts, which means people who aren't really aware of the rules. So people are coming into the Prophet's mosque, which would have been the main attraction in Medina, and they weren't respecting the mosque's sanctity. That's a dominant culture. Lots of chit-chat, not providing them with an alternative space to socialize in, then I could possibly be, or they might just filter back into the mosque. So we're back at square one. So what did he do? He built a batha. Batha is a pavilion. So just like you have this beautiful space outside, once people have connected with their creator, they can connect with their fellow human beings outside. And that social space is so critical and is so important. To be able to, within these mosque spaces, to be able to work on our vertical relationship with Allah, but then also build our horizontal relationship with our fellow human beings. And I'm guilty of this as well. When I go to my mosque, I sometimes like to be the last person in and the first person out, so I don't get collared by somebody else. I don't have to strike up a conversation, so I don't have to wait there and then have a half an hour chit chat and then go home, and then my wife shouted at me because I just disappeared in the mosque for so long. But the mosque is a place for you to disappear in. The mosque is a place for you to disappear in. Become so engrossed and immersed with your conversation with Allah here, and then take that same conversation with your fellow believers outside. The mosque is meant to be that unifying place. So you've seen now how these Ottoman kulliyas were multifaceted, how these Ottoman kulliyas were dynamic, holistic places. They were community centers. They were urban hubs. And that's one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire thrived for so long, because of its institutions. The institution was one of those foundational building blocks within the Ottoman Empire. So, just to recap, because I know we've zipped from topic to topic, we talked about at the start the Madinan blueprint and how that is a schema for us to execute some sort of civilizational revival. We want to restore glory to Islam. We don't want to see our fellow believers being butchered left, right and center. We don't want to see Muslims being lambasted and otherized in the mass media. We don't want to see Muslims on the receiving end of all sorts of hate and vitriol. So where do we start? We start with our mosques. We start with our mosques. Why the mosque? Because if you want to restore balance to the world, piece by piece, then you start by reimagining and revisiting your own miniature versions of your mosques, of the earth, i.e. your mosques. And what was the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? The entire earth has been made the entire earth has been made a mosque for me. We are custodians of the earth. The earth is a mosque, and all of our mosques are little slices of the earth. So we need to care for our mosques as we'd care for a piece of land. Like a tree. Water the tree, nourish the tree. That small sapling, right? Sing to the sapling, expose it to light. Give it your all. Give your mosques your all. And then we had that exercise or experiment. Close your eyes. How did you imagine the Prophet's mosque? Now, be honest here. With all the examples we gave, the Abyssinian spearmen and the Prophet raising funds for people on the spot, and the Abyssinian slough at the back of the mosque, and the Prophet's mosque as a command center and a detention center, and all of these different functions, be honest, did anybody ever visualize any of these things? Nope. For us it was just teaching and learning, which are very important. They are the cornerstones of the mosque, but the mosque is so much more. And then we looked at the Ottoman kulliyas. Now let me give you, we've talked about a lot of theoretical abstractions. Let me give you something practical. 2 points actually. 2 points. Number one is, I call this the 5 C's categorization. I call this the 5 C's categorization. Every single Muslim in the community, every single Muslim will fall into one of these C categories vis-a-vis their relationship with the mosque. So you have 5. You have the creators, you have the contributors, you have the conduits or the connectors, you have the consumers, and then you have the cloaked. So I'll say them again. You have the creators, then you have the contributors, then you have the conduits or the connectors, then you have the consumers, and then you have the cloaked. So when I say creators, I mean in every single mosque institution, you will have the visionaries. And these are the ones who initiate the projects. These are the ones who lead at the helm. They're the ones who build the structures from the ground up. They don't wait for an invitation. They're the ones who create what's missing. And you'll know your mosque best. There might be creators sat here, or you might know creators who are somewhere else. Agreed? Right? There are creators in a mosque. These are the different demographics, the creators. One level down, you have the contributors. So these people might not be able to give original contributions, meaning in terms of strategies, or in terms of leadership, or in terms of policies, or paving new ground, or breaking new records for the mosque. But these contributors are the backbone of the mosque. They show up day in, day out. They give time, money, and skills. And without them, the best ideas conjured up by the contributors will stall and become stagnant. So they may not draw the blueprints, the contributors, but they definitely lay the bricks. Right? And I'm sure you'll all be able to identify some contributors in your midst. One level down. You then have the conduits. So these are people who might not have the intellectual aptitude to be able to devise new plans for the mosque, or take the mosque into new directions, or broaden the mosque horizon. And they might not be in a financial state to be able to contribute monetarily. They might not have the time to be able to devote to the mosque's projects. But they are the bridge builders, and they are the connectors. So they will definitely say, you know what, I might not be able to attend, but I'll tell my friends, and I'll tell my family, and I'll share your social media posts, and I'll subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I'll make sure his name is projected far and wide. These people, I would say, they're the arteries of the community. So those people whose WhatsApp statuses are always flooded with events in the mosque. And you might get a little bit fed up having to keep on pressing how many posters has he put up today. But what did the Prophet say? بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Convey, even if it's just one verse from me. So to transmit knowledge, to transmit projects or posters, I mean, you're providing a pathway. And who knows? You might be able to guide somebody else in the right direction. So these are the conduits. They allow the ideas and the project of the mosque to flow. So they turn the mosque from an island into a network, Right, so let's just, number one, we had the contributors, then we had the creators, then we had the conduits and the connectors, right? And I'm sure there'll be plenty of connectors and conduits here. Actually, none of us should have, nobody, I mean, we're glued to our phones 24/7, so it doesn't cost anything to just send a couple of messages or to let your family members know. Number four, the consumers. I'll hopefully wrap up in around 5 minutes, inshallah. Is that okay, Muslim? Number four, the consumers. These are the people who take part in the programs. They give a little bit back, but it's not really problematic. Their presence isn't really harmful. It's actually appreciated, because what use would the contributions of the contributors be? What use would the creations of the creators be? What use would the connections of the conduits be if there would be no consumers? Right? So we need people to engage, we need people to sit in projects, we need people to go out canvassing, we need people to take part in the tabligh outreach effort, we need people to take part in Ansaar, we need the consumers. But the consumers might need to square up to themselves sometimes and look themselves in the mirror and ask, is my potential being wasted and unrealized? Should I be doing a little bit more than just consuming? Consuming is fantastic. The mosque is here for the facilities of the mosque to be consumed. But try and give a little bit back. That's number four. Have the cloaked. There is actually a sociological phenomenon called the unmosqued Muslim. And it's actually quite dangerous, coming from the word unmoored. So these are people whose ships aren't tethered to the dock. Now, you have to appreciate these mosques as islands of religiosity in a sea of irreligiosity. These mosques are our bastions and our havens and our sanctuaries. If a Muslim is unmosqued, he's not tethered to the mosque, then his ship is drifting in a stormy sea. And who knows which shore it might wash up on. So the unmosqued. And it's a very, very daunting and scary phenomenon, because when I was an imam, I knew people who lived on the mosque's doorstep that were unmosqued. They were cloaked. Cloaked meaning hidden from the community. They were invisible in Muslim spaces, and they were unseen. So these are the 5 demographics. Now when you go home today, ask yourself, which one do I fit into? Which one do I fit into? And hopefully, I mean, because we're all here now, that means we've reached the bottom line, at least, the baseline, which is we're all consumers. So at the bare minimum, consumers should try to haul up the cloaked and the unmosqued Muslim and upgrade them into consumers. So you might have a neighbor, he doesn't get involved in the mosque. Just bring him along. Tell him to tag along. Incentivize coming into the mosque. If you're a consumer, become a conduit. If you're a conduit, become a contributor. If you're a contributor, then become a creator. So these 5 C's are very important. And I've formulated, so, I mean, Moulana has been in the business for decades now, may Allah bless him. We've got other people here who've been in the mosque scene for a while. And I'm sure you probably agree, most people would be neatly categorized into any one of these 5. Once you have these 4, and you have people contributing, then the mosque's activities need to diversify. This is my final point here. The mosque's activities need to diversify. So we need to have an educational facility. There needs to be the educational wing. There needs to be the social welfare or social program wing. There needs to be provision set up for refugees, for migrants. There needs to be after-school clubs. There needs to be something as simple as a careers advice session. Why should your children be going to a secular space where a secular educationist tells them, let me give you some careers advice options? Bring a Muslim in, sit them at the back, here's an informal advice session, ask away. I mean, we're in Lancaster. I mean, you have the cream of the crop of the middle class intellectuals here. You've got Lancaster University on your doorstep. Plenty of professionals here. You have to appreciate that there are people in your community. They might not be scholars, and they might not be involved in the management, but their help is unimaginably important. They need to be brought into the mosque, and their services need to be volunteered to the mosque. I'll give you an example. In the mosque that I was at in Preston, we had a Scouts Association, so you might want to look that up, opening up a Muslim Scouts, 10th Forward Scouts it was called, and there was a 50-person waiting list for Muslims for the Scouts Association. So somebody came up to us, an electrician, and he said, I want to help out, I want to be a contributor, but I don't know how I can help the mosque. And I was really impressed. The office door, I'm an IT specialist, how can I help? I'm a gardener, How can I help? I'm a school teacher. How can I help? I'm a youth coach. How can I help? He said, I'm an electrician. How can I help? So we said, you know what? The timing is just serendipitous, because next week we have, with the Scouts kids, we're working on their circuits badge to build circuits, and they can have their badge. You're an electrician, so you can lead that session. And he was over the moon. And it might be something trivial, but we'd provided a pathway into the mosque for him, and believe it or not, he became a regular attendee of the mosque afterwards. Do you know why? Because he felt included. He felt included in the mosque. One thing I learned from one of my, actually out of all the people who gave me advice just before I became an imam, was my uncle and my dad. And their advice proved to be indispensable. My uncle told me, become a sponge, open up your ears, and provide an attentive ear to everybody. Listen to what everybody has to say. Sometimes it might be absolute drivel. Sometimes it might be a revolutionary idea. And I had a doctor who came up to me, and the doctor said, look, in the hospital, in each ward, we have a champion, we have a children's champion, we have a disabled champion. I said, what do you mean? He said, these sort of represent the, maybe you could say, underprivileged elements of society. Right? Children, their voices might not be heard as much. Women, their voices might not be heard as much. Disabled voices might not be heard as much. So we had delegated a representative to sit at our ward council meetings to be able to say, you know what, I brought to say, so a child champion might say, I came into the ward the other day and there was no creche. So I was here in the operating theatre. Where do you want me to keep my child? So actually that's a good suggestion. And the next day they had a creche or something of a makeshift playroom. So for people to feel included in the mosque, they need to be valued. You need to make them feel like this is your place in the mosque as well. The mosque isn't just for people who wear clothes like this, or people who have a beard, or people who are, people who are exemplary Muslims. The mosque is for a nominal Muslim. The mosque is for a Muslim who might not have prayed his prayers in years. The mosque is for everyone, and it should act as a catalyst. But for that, to have a diverse portfolio of activities, right? Feeding the homeless, civic engagements, engaging with the local council. When we were at the mosque in Preston, then we would host charities like Bernardo's and charities like St. Catherine's Hospice. So we made an effort of reaching out to them. Now the plus point there was, whenever they had a Muslim orphan who came into care, they knew the mosque has reached out to us in the past, so let's go to the mosque. With St. Catherine's Hospice, right? We went to St. Catherine's Hospice and we said, you know what? We need to destigmatize palliative end-of-life care. And it worked brilliantly, because now Muslims were being funneled into the hospice setting, and whenever they had a problem, then they would call me saying, look, we've got a Muslim here. Should we be able to provide, how should we provide for them? So I'd say, okay, halal food. Perfect, we didn't think of that before. So you're building bridges. The mosque should be an outreach center. But for that, and I'll leave you with the last point, there needs to be two teams. The mosque needs to have two teams. This is not just the ability of the imam, because Moulana's plate is already filled sky high. Moulana has a lot of responsibilities. The management will also have responsibilities, right? And they can't constantly ask for help or volunteers. You guys, community members, you need to volunteer your services. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet would make petitions and the companions would volunteer their services. The companions would volunteer, sometimes unsolicited. The Prophet never asked Uthman radiallahu anhu to buy a well and then to designate it as a charitable endowment. Uthman radiallahu anhu heard the Muslims were suffering a water shortage. He didn't wait for the Imam, the Prophet, to say, come on, we need to raise some money for a well. Uthman took the initiative, bought a well at an extortionately high price from the Jewish owner, because the Jewish man knew, supply and demand, he knew there's a demand here and I have the only well, so let me charge him an arm and a leg. Uthman had no qualms paying an arm and a leg. The moment he bought it, he designated it as a charitable endowment, as a waqf. There you have the first waqf in Islamic history. What did Uthman do? He volunteered his services. He didn't wait for the Prophet to say, we need help here. So your services are required by the mosque. The mosque might not know. Brother Yusuf here, he's doing a fantastic job setting up the the YouTube channel and the social media pages. I had in Preston a university lecturer from the university in Manchester, and his forte, he was a lecturer in sports marketing, right? So I thought he might have something to offer. So I had to sit down with him, and he said, look, the reason why mosques aren't having full attendance for lectures and for programs is because you're marketing in the wrong way. I said, what do you mean? He said, when you make a poster, do it like this. And when you send out a poster, have strategic timings and have like a staggered release a system for posters and things as small as how to market an event, right? He gave his expertise. And in our Friday sermon, before the sermon even started, with a pre-sermon speech, at least 60, 70 people who came. And that was by virtue of the suggestions he gave. So people are there hungry, right, to give their expertise. But we need two types of teams within the mosque. We need the initiators and the consolidators. We need people who are always looking to the horizon, to broaden the horizons of the mosque, to take the mosque to new levels. But we also need the consolidators, who are keeping things organized and structured, and who are holding the foundations together. Too often in our mosques, we suffer from a phenomenon called, what I like to call, mosque firefighting. So you have parental firefighting, which is, you don't proactively try to nurture or rear your child, you just reactively respond to all sorts of problems. So, there's a problem with a certain aspect of the mosque, or the youth aren't coming to the mosque, or there's no space for, there are no educational classes for the women, or the women aren't feeling included. So, what do we do? Oh, let's just quickly plaster over the issues and, maybe just dangle a carrot just to keep people happy and placated for now. And then when the next problem arises, we'll deal with it then. That's a wrong type of attitude to have. Don't be reactive, be proactive. We have a huge demographic of women here, so let's have a women's coffee morning on a Saturday. Let's invite a female scholar in to have a Quran commentary session with the sisters. Let's have, in another space in the mosque should have a recreational zone. In the recreational zone, let's have a creche, so a mothers and children's session. So new mothers who have just come in and they don't know where the other mothers are and how to react and interact with society, then they have a social platform and a social forum here for converts, for new Muslims as well. New Muslims need to be integrated into the mosque. There needs to be a dedicated liaison officer in the mosque who actively looks for new Muslims, brings them into the mosque, integrates them and makes them feel at home. But we need the initiators and the consolidators. The final example is we need people who are looking down to make sure we're not tripping over rocks and to make sure the path ahead is smooth. But we also need people who are looking ahead to make sure that we don't walk over a cliff. Without either of these two groups, our mosque will not be able to flourish and they won't be able to thrive. So remember, the entire earth is a mosque, but our mosques are miniature versions and microcosms of the earth. And the type of tender, loving care we give to the earth, we have to give that to our mosques. Remember those 5 C's. Let's just enumerate them. We have the creators, and we have the contributors, we have the conduits, connectors, we have the consumers, and we have the cloaked and the unmosqued. Don't be number 5. Try and be from, baseline is number 4. Try and improve your package and upgrade to number 3, number 2, or number 1. And finally, diversify the activities of the mosque. Tawheed. All roads should lead to the mosque. And the historical example, the Ottoman Kulliyah. So next time you go to Turkey and you come across the Suleymaniya complex or the Sultan Mehmed Fatih complex, then remember, this is the quintessential mosque. This is the epitome of a mosque. A multifaceted urban communal center where everybody feels at home and everybody feels that they have a space there. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to transform all of our mosques into the original model of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he allows us to have an important proactive role to play in community building and in reimagining and reinventing our mosque spaces. Thank you for listening so patiently. Jazakumullah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.